Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I am delighted to wish you a happy King Arthur's Day. This is a day of celebration, and the occasion, of course, is Arthur, the once and future King of Britain. This isn't the only celebratory video. This is part of a wider project being put together by Nathan Hood, so keep your eyes and ears peeled for more videos from both him and others. I have something to confess. Although I am going to be discussing King Arthur, I am largely ignorant of the primary source material. I have read the myths and legends of the Iliad, the Odyssey, Beowulf, Gilgamesh, and El Cid, but I have not read the quote-unquote canon texts of the Arthur legendarium. Like most people in the British Isles, I have interacted with the Arthur legend via secondary media, and by secondary media, I mean media based on and inspired by the original stories. For example, the 1996 film, Dragonheart. In the film, King Arthur is long dead, and the protagonist, Bowen, is a disenchanted and cynical knight who used to follow the old code of Arthur and of Camelot. Even though the characters of the King Arthur legend do not appear in the film, their influence on the story is felt. However, for the purposes of this essay, the fact I haven't read the original sources does not disqualify me from commenting on King Arthur. It actually recommends me to this discussion, because I am going to be exploring the idea and ideal of King Arthur among the people of the British Isles, rather than the actual stories themselves. As I said earlier, most people in Great Britain have not read the foundational texts of the Arthur legendarium. However, if you start a conversation with the average person about King Arthur, you will find there is an already preconceived image and idea of who he is and what he stands for. And, what is more, you will discover that he is well liked. The King Arthur story has been buried deep in the consciousness of the English, Welsh and Scottish peoples. Although the vast majority would struggle to give you any detailed plot events or a vivid summary of the legends, some story elements would stand prominently in any recounting. A typical recounting from the average person, familiar with some secondary media, might sound something like this. A long time ago, Britain was being harried by enemies and was without a king. It was a dark age. However, hope lay in a mythical sword which had been thrust into an almighty stone. Everyone knew only the true King of Britain could draw this blade, and the people waited for the day when he would reveal himself. Then one day, a young man called Arthur, sought out and tutored by the wizard Merlin, stepped up to the stone and drew it aloft, confirming his claim to the throne of Britain. The people, seeing that their king had finally come, rallied around Arthur, and he assembled the finest knights in the kingdom and drove back the invaders, restoring peace and freedom to the realm. Somewhere in these events, Arthur visits the Lady of the Lake and receives Excalibur, an almighty and powerful blade which acts as further proof of his worthiness to rule. After defeating the invaders, Arthur set the affairs of the kingdom into order. He formed the Knightly Order of the Round Table, instituted a code of chivalry, and, during this time of peace, he and his knights decided to go on quests and adventures, sometimes separately, and sometimes together. Here perhaps the recounter will say something about dragons, the Holy Grail, the Black Knight, and perhaps even the Green Knight. But this golden age of peace was finally ended when Britain's enemies gathered their forces in one last attempt to destroy the kingdom, and Arthur in response rallied his forces and the Knights of the Round Table for a final battle. When the dust settled on that dark, blood-soaked day, Arthur was victorious, but he was mortally wounded in the fight, and was taken by his knights to the island of Avalon to be buried. However, some say he is not dead, but instead sleeping, and that he will awake from his slumber when Britain needs him most. When the darkest hour comes, when all hope seems lost, Arthur will return. This average Joe's plot summary, painted in the broadest strokes with fuzzy detail in between key events, does not, on its face, seem so special. But it is not the details that matter as much as the idea and animating spirit behind them. This story, even in low resolution, paints a picture of Arthur, which is understood by all English, Scottish, and Welshmen. If you belong to any of these ethnic groups, I have a question. What words would you use to describe King Arthur? Don't think too hard, just write what immediately comes into your mind on a piece of paper. For me personally, the words strong, courageous, mighty, brave, and noble all come without effort, along with words like king, knight, and warrior. All are positive associations, connotations, and traits. And I am willing to bet that very similar words are on your lists, ladies and gentlemen. This is not an accident. The brief summary from before contains what seem to be small details, but they are actually pivotal to our common understanding of King Arthur. Arthur, while being skilled at arms and fighting, doesn't make himself the king of Britain through force. Instead, he proves his right to rule by drawing the sword from the stone, and later by wielding Excalibur. He is chosen by the land itself, represented by the stone and the Lady of the Lake. He is a force to be reckoned with personally, but his real power and strength comes from being a leader. He rallies the greatest warriors to his banner and then drives out the invaders, defending those who cannot defend themselves. After this, he restores the kingdom and sets in place a code of ethics realized as an order of chivalry, so that both he and his knights do not abuse their power or the common folk who have been placed under their care. Later, King Arthur makes the ultimate sacrifice, dying to defend his country. So what do we have here? We have the ultimate example of the good king. He does not seek to take power which doesn't belong to him. He doesn't lord over those beneath him, but accepts the mantle with humility and strength, and then pursues virtue and fairness during his reign. This is a man who we'd all like to see ruling Great Britain. King Arthur is the gold standard of what a good king should be, and he is a great personification of a warrior king. Now, some here may bring up less than flattering details about King Arthur from different parts of the Arthur mythology, such as him being cuckolded by Lancelot. However, I'd argue these details are ephemeral to the great achievements and virtues of Arthur in the canon stories, and especially in the common person's perception of who Arthur is. If you mention King Arthur among the regular public, they don't think of a cuckold. Most conversations about King Arthur lead to this question. Was he real? People want to believe that King Arthur was real, but was he actually, in fact, a real person? Whenever this question is eventually asked, there is always that one cynical person who says, "Don't be stupid. He is a silly fairy tale character for children," or something to that effect. The cynical person is right in part. There is no one called Arthur in the historical record who did the deeds previously described. It would appear that the character of King Arthur is a poetic creation inspired by many things, but primarily by these two. First, very real persons who have shown great courage, wisdom, and strength in history, such as King Alfred the Great of Wessex. Second, the general historical story of the British Isles. Great Britain is different from the countries found on the European continent. Invasions of Great Britain have been relatively rare in comparison to the invasions suffered by other countries due to the difficulty of crossing the sea. As a consequence, the major invasions of Britain can be counted on one hand. The last invasion of England happened in 1066, but, of course, Danish, Anglo-Saxon, and Roman invasions preceded the Norman invasion and left their mark on the land and people as well. Historically speaking, living in the British Isles was generally safe, providing you were on good terms with your immediate neighbours, which is why invasion, a distant threat when compared to other countries, has always been so disruptive on the island. A common theme in British history and fiction is the defence of the island. Throughout history, the English and the British have fought in the waters surrounding the island to defend her from invasion. Notable defenders include Francis Drake and Horatio Nelson. The British people have seen and continue to see the invasion of their land, of their island, as a very dark thing, which has to be prevented at all costs. This understanding of history contextualizes the story of King Arthur, who comes to Britain's aid when the invasion has already happened, when the darkest unthinkable has already taken place. But moving back to our cynical person's answer to the all-important question, King Arthur was not real, in the sense that there was never a real historical figure who bore his name and who did the mighty deeds described in the old tales. But our cynical friend is wrong to dismiss him on this account, because King Arthur is real in a different sense. Let us recall the end of the myth. They say that Arthur is not dead, but instead sleeping on the island of Avalon, waiting for the time when Britain needs him again. Now, of course, mortal men cannot sleep for hundreds of years, so realistically, it is silly to believe such a thing. However, as already established, King Arthur is an idea, an ideal, and ideals are indestructible. King Arthur, the man, may never have lived, but King Arthur, the ideal, lives on. King Arthur sleeps and waits for the time when a worthy man will assume the mantle of leadership over the British Isles. When such a man comes, the spirit of King Arthur will manifest in him and act as the standard and inspiration for his quest to rule Great Britain in freedom and with fairness. He will be Arthur reborn, and people will recognize the spirit and the ideal manifesting in concrete form. King Arthur is real and is certainly not dead, because he lives as the golden standard and perfect ideal of what a good king should be, and Britain still waits for him.